Woke grifters and charlatans are out of luck after a unanimous Supreme Court ruling just shut their grift down. All this and so much more is coming up on today's episode of the Barad vs. Everyone podcast, our daily show where we take on the craziest ideas from across the internet, our media, and our politics, all from an independent perspective. Up first, like I mentioned, we're going to touch on the Supreme Court because a huge ruling just got handed down, which I think is being somewhat lost in just the noise of everything else that's going down, including the riots in Los Angeles, which I will touch on. I'm still gathering facts, and I might actually discuss it with a couple of guests this Wednesday. But in the meantime, this Supreme Court ruling is absolutely huge in its ramifications and in the fact that it's unanimous. Even the most liberal judges on the court, appointed by Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and so on, came out and ruled against a very prominent left-wing idea that lots of the anti-racism and woke grifters, the Robin DiAngelos and Ibram X. Kendis of the world, rely on for their activism. Well, it's illegal now. Well, it actually always was, but now it's clarified and unambiguous. Here's some reporting from The Hill about this case that the Supreme Court just ruled on, then we'll get into some details.
Supreme Court decision season is in full swing, with the justices just this week handing down 6 opinions that range from religion to guns to discrimination. You might call it unanimous day at the Supreme Court. Both the liberal and conservative justices all agreed on 3 major cases. First up was a straight woman's claims that her former employer discriminated against her for being heterosexual. Marlene Ames said that her gay supervisor at the Ohio Department of Youth Services passed over her for a promotion in favor of a lesbian woman. Then, Ames was demoted, and a gay man was hired to take her place. So Ames sued under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the landmark 1964 federal law that protects against employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Lower courts said that Ames, however, had to show something more than the normal requirements because she was straight. The lower court said that Ames had to show background circumstances that proves that hers is the rare case where an employer was discriminating against the majority. But in that 9-0 decision authored by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, former President Biden's appointee to the court, the Supreme Court rejected that theory, sending Ames's case back for another look. Quote, Congress left no room for courts to impose special requirements on majority group plaintiffs alone, Jackson wrote for the majority.
So this is a huge deal. It really is. And our government is so divided and so partisan and so ideological, but sometimes, especially in the judicial branch, you still have consensus and unanimity. And this is one of those times because they just ruled 9-0, all the judges, all the justices on board, liberal and conservative, that reverse discrimination isn't really a thing. It's just discrimination. So the case is about an Ohio woman, Marlene Ames, who claims she was discriminated against in employment for being heterosexual, the kind of practice that sometimes gets called reverse discrimination. She had worked for the Ohio Department of Youth Services, a government agency that's responsible for overseeing the juvenile criminal justice system since 2004. In 2019, she applied for a management job and was passed over for it, with the job ultimately going to a lesbian woman. But it didn't stop there. Ames was then removed from her job and given a demotion while a gay man was put into the job she previously occupied, which, if you ask me, is quite the coincidence. So she sued under the Civil Rights Act. She sued her employer, this government agency, because the Civil Rights Act includes protections, has been expanded to include protections for sexual orientation, and that doesn't just protect gay people. On the face of the law, it also protects you from being discriminated against for being heterosexual, which is what this woman alleges happened to her. But federal appeals courts ruled that because she was a member of a majority group claiming discrimination, she had to prove a higher evidentiary burden than a minority group member would in order to proceed with her case. That's what she challenged to the Supreme Court, and they just ruled that, nope, that's not how this works. Writing for the Supreme Court, Biden appointee Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote that the Civil Rights Act and federal anti-discrimination laws make no distinction between the protections for majority group members or minority group members and don't allow for these kind of two-tier systems. Simply put, reverse discrimination is just discrimination, and it's just as illegal as traditional discrimination. Now, I first thought when I saw this was like how sad it is that we even needed a Supreme Court ruling to establish this, something that seems like just such common sense and seems like so uncontroversial, but we actually do, because we have seen this rise in openly discriminatory policies targeted against white people, Asian people, and I guess in this case, potentially heterosexual people. Although what they ruled on was not exactly her claim is true and proven, but just on the principles of the legal standards. We don't actually know if she was discriminated against or not, but it certainly has happened that there have been instances of anti-heterosexual discrimination. Not that I think it's wildly rampant or anything of the sort, but it's still wrong. Yet the real significance here is that a huge strain of progressive activism and thought that really rose to prominence in the post-2020 COVID era was now just basically unambiguously, unanimously affirmed to be blatantly illegal. Remember the anti-racist author Ibram X. Kendi and his best-selling book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that every liberal wine mom had on their coffee table after George Floyd was killed to show what a good ally they were. Well, that book openly said that, and this is a quote, "The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination." This approach was embodied in many progressive policies, from like race-conscious COVID programs that only extended certain small business and farmer benefits to minority-owned businesses and literally excluded or otherwise deprioritized certain majority group members, even if they'd been affected by the same emergency these programs were supposed to be addressing, to the traditional affirmative action policies that openly discriminated against Asian Americans in particular, but also white Americans, to promote lower standards for African American and other underrepresented applicants. Then there's things like slavery reparations, which explicitly call to take money from some people and give it to other people on the basis of their race. Some of these plans may be well-intentioned. I mean, they may be put forward by people who genuinely think they're promoting like racial harmony or progress or something. I'm open to that, but they're still not. And they're still blatantly illegal. And if you're not convinced that this is even a thing that we need to think about or worry about, let me read you this jaw-dropping statistic from Bloomberg. This was published in September of 2023. Corporate America promised to hire a lot more people of color. It actually did. The year after Black Lives Matter protests, the S&P 100 added more than 300,000 jobs. 94% went to people of color. So I'm not a believer in the idea that like disproportionate statistics inherently mean discrimination must be happening. But in this case, it seems pretty obvious to me that there is no way in America, especially at high levels of corporate America, that you're just taking the most qualified people and 94% of them across hundreds of thousands of jobs are not any white people. That's sus. That's incredibly sus. And even if in many of those cases it was a merit-based hiring decision, in a fair number, it had to have been some form of reverse discrimination, which, again, is just discrimination and is illegal. So this Supreme Court ruling sends a message that this kind of thing isn't allowed and establishes the same legal pathways that exist for remedying traditional instances of discrimination for this kind of discrimination as well. And I think as this pathway unfolds and as more people bring lawsuits, we will come to see that especially post-2020, this kind of thing, while blatantly illegal, was fairly widespread, especially in liberal-dominated institutions like higher education and some parts of corporate America and media. Even the journalist Jesse Signal, who I appreciate and I like his work a lot, basically admitted that he doesn't have empirical data on it, but in liberal circles in journalism and academia and these other places, basically everyone knew that they were explicitly just not hiring white people and not promoting white people for certain roles. And he says that this stuff will come out in the wash as this is further litigated, and I tend to agree. Now, this Supreme Court decision is very, very, very bad news for like the charlatans and the hucksters who enriched themselves on this identity politics grift, because a lot of what they're selling was just unanimously affirmed by the Supreme Court to be blatantly illegal. So it's a tough day to be Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi or one of these other grifters, but whether you're left, center, or right of center, just for Americans in general who want to live in America where everybody from different backgrounds lives in harmony and is treated the same under the law and in society, it's actually a great day and a great ruling that reminds us that even in these divided political times, sometimes sanity can still achieve consensus. At least that's how I'm looking at it. That's why I was really happy to see this decision, and why I particularly thought it was great that even the liberal justices signed on and authored this opinion. But what do you think? Do let me know in the comments. Do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet, and do hit that like button while you're at it. Up next, we're going to talk about the latest crazy update in the never-ending saga of cringe known as Greta Thunberg. But first, today's episode is sponsored by me, by my new second channel, More Brad Polumbo, where I will be uploading and have been uploading exclusive long-form and medium-form content that you will only see if you subscribe to this new channel. This includes my responses to haters who make videos about me, videos where I react to X-rated Instagram reels.
Does this kitty like that I stopped wearing deodorant? Yeah, you gonna give me a purr?
Long-form interviews with interesting people who I want to talk to outside of my normal programming. Plus, I'm also uploading my TV clips and hits from when I'm in the media over there as well. All that and more. Subscribe to the More Brad Polumbo channel, linked in the description or in the pinned comment. Now, we got to talk about Greta, because Greta Thunberg is playing the victim again. This time, she found a way to make the Israel-Hamas war and the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza about herself and her friends, and to hog the spotlight and sort of engage in this kind of narcissistic exercise where she and a bunch of other activists boarded a boat with a relatively small amount of aid on it, and then absurdly set sail to pierce the blockade. Israel has the Gaza Strip blockaded as part of their war, and deliver aid, and somehow they thought they were gonna get through or something. I mean, in reality, they knew they wouldn't, but they just wanted to draw attention to themselves rather than the very real humanitarian suffering. They could have used their platform to fundraise for charities that actually help these people or something like that, but instead they decided to make themselves the star of the show. And now, when the inevitable happened and Israel intercepted them and prohibited them from entering the war zone, they're playing the victim. Here's Greta's latest social media upload.
My name is Greta Thunberg and I am from Sweden. If you see this video, we have been intercepted and kidnapped in international waters by the Israeli occupational forces or forces that support Israel. I urge all my friends, family and comrades to put pressure on the Swedish government to release me and the others as soon as possible.
So, listen, I've been a Greta Thunberg hater. If Greta has no haters, I must be dead. An accident must have happened, a tragedy must have occurred, I must no longer be in this world. But even I, as a hater, did not expect her video to be this diabolical. Using the word kidnapped to describe yourself in this situation, when there are still hostages in Gaza who were taken on October 7th, is insanely ridiculous, absurd, insensitive, and offensive. It is making a mockery of that term. The Israeli military intercepted their little activist flotilla, turned them around, and I think frickin' gave them sandwiches, and is just sending them home and not letting them into this active war zone. The exact thing they always knew that was going to happen. And here they are, playing the victim and claiming to have been kidnapped. What a profound insult. What a mockery they are making of the very real humanitarian suffering in Gaza. And there's just so many layers to this. You know, cue that Shrek clip about the onion. The layers here are infinite of hypocrisy and absurdity. For example, watch Greta and her environmental buddies, right? Remember, she's the big environmental activist, throw all their devices into the water as soon as they see the Israeli forces coming.
Mobilisez-vous! Mobilisez-vous! Go to the places! Ditch the phones! Ditch the phones! Ditch the phones! Yes. Phones in the water, please!
Did we really just watch the buddies of the most famous environmental activist in the world engage in massive plastic pollution in the ocean? I think we did. And also, I'm a little confused as to what they're so worried about that's on their devices. There's a tweet for everything. The problem of plastic pollution in the ocean is even worse than anyone feared. There's actually more microplastic 1,000 feet down there than there is in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. We can't continue like this. Yeah? Funny how that one went straight out the window when it came to ditching potential evidence, I guess, against you, which again, I'm not even sure what would have been on these devices that would have gotten you in so much trouble. But like when it comes to an attention-seeking stunt to try to paint yourself as a victim of Israel, all that goes out the window. Funny how that works. Now, say what you will about the Israeli government, and I am not a supporter of them or many of their actions these days, but their social media game on this particular incident was admirable. The Israel Foreign Ministry tweeted, "All the passengers of the, quote, selfie yacht are safe and unharmed. They were provided with sandwiches and water. The show is over." And they included video of this.
Where is he?
Selfie yacht is actually hilarious. Give whatever intern came up with that a raise. I'm sorry. I know this is like a very serious situation, but that shit is funny. At the end of the day, what we have here is just peak celebrity cringe virtue signaling. A totally pointless stunt that, no, despite what some defenders are claiming, has not raised awareness of the humanitarian suffering in Gaza. It's distracted from it and made Greta the center of attention, which is really what she is all about. Like, if there's one defining ethos of the Greta Thunberg philosophy, it's that everything imaginable needs to be about Greta Thunberg. That's really it. And it's made a mockery of the very real suffering that's occurred on both sides of this conflict, especially when they're saying they were kidnapped and other absurdities that, again, are just so wildly inaccurate and insensitive in this context. And when this was always doomed to fail, and they could have actually used their celebrity and their influence to try to help these people, to try to fundraise for actual, humanitarian groups or aid organizations that are able to work inside Gaza right now. I'm sure there's something that can be done to help the countless innocent people, the women and children and babies caught up in this war. And that's an admirable thing to want to do, but not if your real goal is to draw attention to yourself, to have yourself go viral on social media, all while knowing you will never be allowed in. The aid you brought, which isn't even very much and wouldn't make a difference really, won't actually get to anyone. So it's an entirely pointless and fruitless endeavor that they always knew was going to end exactly how it ended, and it only served to self-aggrandize, to promote their own egos, and get them, unfortunately, lots of loving and glowing coverage from left-wing influencers and media. But really, those people, of all people, should be the harshest critics of people like Greta Thunberg, because this kind of activism does not help advance the Palestinian people or their cause whatsoever. It makes a mockery out of it and reminds everyone what we find so insufferable about the liberal elite. Other than that, though, great work, Greta. You're doing amazing. Next, we're going to talk about some journalism drama, because an ABC News correspondent finds himself in some serious hot water after going after Trump and Trump appointee Stephen Miller in very personal terms on X, aka Twitter. Terry Moran is the senior national correspondent for ABC News. He actually interviewed President Trump a couple months ago, and he is ostensibly a neutral, unbiased reporter. But he tweeted something over the weekend that was not so unbiased or neutral. He wrote, "The thing about Stephen Miller is not that he is the brains behind Trumpism. Yes, he is one of the people who conceptualizes the impulse of the Trumpist movement and translates them into policy. But that's not what's interesting about Miller. It's not brains, it's bile. Miller is a man who is richly endowed with the capacity for hatred. He's a world-class hater. You can see this just by looking at him, because you can see that his hatreds are his spiritual nourishment. He eats his hate. Trump is a world-class hater, but his hatred only is a means to an end, and that end is his own glorification. That's his spiritual nourishment." Wild thing to tweet, and notable that this dude tweeted it at 12:06 a.m. when he probably should have been in bed, and may or may not, there were several typos in this tweet, have been under the influence of some sort of thing. But regardless, and I say this as someone who in particular really dislikes Stephen Miller. I disagree with him on all sorts of things, and I think he's a particularly harmful influence on President Trump. And I think he's kind of represents the most extreme vein of Trumpism that has a lot of disregard for the classically liberal values that I hold. So I'm a big critic of Stephen Miller. I've criticized him on this show. None of that changes the fact, though, that this is wildly inappropriate and unprofessional for a professional journalist who holds a role that ostensibly is impartial and unbiased to tweet such incredibly personal things and insults about the president and one of his top advisors. That's obviously not okay and very clearly violates ABC's policies. The Trump administration was pretty quick to condemn Moran and also call for consequences for him. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt wrote in a tweet last night in a since-deleted post, so-called journalist Terry Moran went on a rampage against Stephen Miller and called President Trump a world-class hater. This is unhinged and unacceptable. We have reached out to ABC to inquire about how they plan to hold Terry accountable. Now, like I said, I do agree. This tweet is wildly unprofessional and unacceptable for a journalist to put out. But it is kind of funny to see the Trump administration upset about personal insults. Bro, Trump says worse things about people all the time. And they don't say that it is unhinged and unacceptable. It's kind of par for the course. But I do agree. It's horrifically impartial and unprofessional. Caroline Leavitt went even further, though, in a television interview with Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business. Take a listen to this.
ABC is going to have to answer for what their, again, so-called journalist put out on Twitter in the wee hours of the night, calling Stephen Miller vile. They said that President Trump is a world-class hater. And this is, again, coming from someone who is supposed to be an unbiased and professional journalist. This is unacceptable and unhinged rhetoric coming from someone who works at a major television network. We have reached out to ABC. They have said they will be taking action, so we will see what they do.
And you said ABC is going to take action. What do you expect that action to be?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, hopefully this journalist will either be suspended or terminated. You cannot go on these unhinged rants against administration officials and the president of the United States. And then clearly he knew he was wrong because he deleted the post as soon as he allegedly woke up this morning.
So the language here gets murky. You actually can go on unhinged rants about the president of the United States and his officials, and that is free speech. So she should be clearer with her words. It is, of course, unprofessional for a journalist to do so, but it's also notable, and we'll come back to this, that she basically called for his firing or suspension. And we can't know whether ABC News would have done this regardless. I'd like to think that they would have, but they did suspend Terry Moran, and they said this in a statement. ABC News announced Sunday that it was suspending Terry Moran over concerns about him violating the outlet's standards on impartiality and objectivity. ABC News stands for objectivity and impartiality in its news coverage and does not condone subjective personal attacks on others. The post does not reflect the views of ABC News and violated our standards. As a result, Terry Moran has been suspended pending further evaluation. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is the correct course of action for ABC News, and it's just kind of obvious to me. This is not an opinion commentator. This is not a pundit. This is not a presenter or like a late night host. This is supposedly a neutral journalist at a very prestigious, or at least it used to be, mainstream media institution that still claims objectivity and neutrality, right? That makes it different than kind of new media or some outlets that are open about their bias. They still claim to be neutral, and they have a top correspondent going on very extreme personal insults and rants against the current administration officials. That's obviously unacceptable behavior for a journalist. I can say this as someone with a background in journalism. You would never typically and shouldn't get away with doing that. But the fact that the White House called for him to be fired or suspended does make me uncomfortable. And I wish they hadn't gone that far. I wish they had just criticized what he said, and then maybe ABC News just decides to suspend him anyway. But I don't think it's proper for the government to be telling media outlets what journalists should be fired. That said, I am not as concerned about this as some of my friends who are very hardline free speech advocates do seem to be, like some of my friends over at FIRE, the nonpartisan foundation for individual rights and expression, where, disclaimer, I do a little bit of freelance work. FIRE President Greg Lukianoff wrote in a tweet, "A lot of us First Amendment defenders come from journalism backgrounds, and I thought Moran's tweet was very unprofessional. The public backlash alone might have gotten him fired, but the administration contacting ABC and demanding ABC hold him, quote, accountable? That's classic jawboning. It was wrong when Biden did it to suppress alleged COVID or other alleged misinformation, and it's wrong here. Ironically, just blasting Moran's tweet wouldn't have raised any First Amendment concerns, and he probably still would have been suspended or fired." Aaron Turr of FIRE as well tweeted, "The White House just admitted to pressuring a private company to punish an employee for criticizing the president and another White House official. This is the type of jawboning that President Trump vowed to end with his January 20 executive order on restoring freedom of speech." So I have mixed feelings on this. I did criticize the Biden administration for pressuring tech companies to take down COVID misinformation and posts, and I do tend to agree that there should be not much government pressure to take down, censor, or punish people over First Amendment protected speech, which, while he can still face professional consequences for it in a private company like ABC News, what Terry Moran did post is First Amendment protected expression. That said, I mean, the request, it does go too far. I do wish they had just stuck to criticizing, but like, he does obviously deserve to be fired, and I'd like to think ABC News would have done it anyway. So this is at the very least not really an example of cancel culture or censorship run amok when just basic standards of professionalism in journalism are being upheld. I do agree it would have been better if the White House had stopped short of calling directly for consequences to happen to him, and it would also, I think, make a lot of Republicans uncomfortable if the Biden administration had specifically demanded that a particular Fox News reporter, Peter Doocy, for example, be fired or suspended, and then Fox News did in fact suspend him. I think that would make a lot of people on the right very uncomfortable and kind of blur the line between government and free press in a way that we wouldn't like. There's sort of the same dynamic at play here. But again, it's just such an egregious violation to me that hopefully he would have been suspended anyway. What do you guys think? Where do you fall on this? Very curious to hear from you guys. Remember, I do take the time to read the comments, so definitely let me know what you think down below. Okay, guys, that'll be it for today's episode of the Barad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Do hit that like button before you go. Remember to subscribe to my second channel. And with that, we'll talk again real soon.